chasing the crowd. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Blue Boar Tavern. Come have a seat, chat amongst yourselves. You've got a chat button right there at your table. You can ask us questions as the gang comes in here. We should see some pretty soon. So welcome. And I've got an interesting challenge for our crew tonight, too. So we'll see what they think of that. So here comes Dorothea. Hi.
Hi there.
How are you?
I'm well.
It's been a while. We're getting more and more crowds here every time. So yeah. This is very rewarding.
Hello.
Tom, hello.
Good to see you.
And I think here comes Bryan.
Hi,
hello.
Bryan.
One of our newest members. Hello. Good to have you again.
Yeah, good to be back in the tavern.
Phoebe should be here soon, ably filling Bonner's seat. There she is. Hi, Phoebe.
Cheers. Cheers.
Cheers, everybody. Nice to see you. I was just telling everyone else streaming in here that they can chat amongst themselves with the chat button that's there at their table. And they could pass notes to us almost as if there's a question and answer button there. So welcome, everyone. Have fun. Now, you guys, we're going to do something a bit different because after one of our meetings here, we were chatting one time about all these different names that come up in Oxfordian talk. You hear them during the speeches, you read about them in the book, people in his social class, in his class circle, people in his literary circle, but you don't hear much about them otherwise. So it's like we get these little maybe cartoon ideas. So Tom threw out this phrase going from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids, who are those guys? But I was thinking, yeah, okay, since the Oxfordian view tends to make Elizabethan England more real rather than just like a Renaissance fair Shakespeare in the Park experience, who are these guys? Make them real instead of just these soundbite Oxfordian caricatures. So I issued you a challenge, and I'll tell the audience this. I told each of our 4 table members here that they have to come in with their favorite person whose name regularly comes up in Oxfordian discussions, who they think people should know more about. And if you didn't do it, you have to stay late and clean the dishes here.
Our favorite or most notorious person, maybe.
Well, the person you think people should know most about. And if you don't get any free pretzels until you tell us all about that. So in this discussion, I'm going to be the average person and ask maybe some dumb questions or give my impression of, okay, here's what I know about that person, which isn't much. Then we'll go around and you'll have like a minute to give your elevator pitch who this person is, but then we'll go from there into more depth, and you can take as much time as you want or not, but don't worry, it's not a lecture. It's a conversation, free flowing, have fun. That's what we're here for. So, and I'm sure as we talk about these different people, connections will come up between them spontaneously and serendipitously, and that's fine. That'll be fun. So what do you guys think of that? Are you ready?
Yeah.
Really? Yeah, I'm looking forward to learning a lot, I have to say.
Well, I think Tom should start, since the idea.
Yeah, who are those guys?
He's a Butch Cassidy fan.
Tom, who's your guy?
So my guy is probably the most remarkable Elizabethan Renaissance man most people have never heard of, and that's Fulke Greville, who lived to be 74 years old and could have lived a lot longer had it not been for a very unfortunate end that he encountered. Came from a wealthy Warwickshire family near Stratford-on-Avon. He worked for, if you will, 3 monarchs, Elizabeth, James, and Charles. He was a statesman, soldier, sailor, spy who worked for Francis Walsingham, literary patron, dramatist, poet. He served as Chancellor of the Exchequer and Recorder of Stratford-upon-Avon. After 1606, he and his father, between them, were effectively the chief magistrates and primary family of Stratford-upon-Avon. The entire life of the famous playwright citizen, yet there's never been a shred of evidence for any contact between the man from Stratford and Fulke Greville. He was a childhood, lifelong friend of Sir Philip Sidney and Sidney's sister, Mary, Countess of Pembroke. He was a patron of writers such as Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Nash, Samuel Daniel, Edmund Spenser, William Davenant, and Ben Jonson. He was also, for those of you who know about the famous tennis match quarrel between Philip Sidney and Edward de Vere, Fulke Greville was the person who actually wrote that down, so that we get the story from Fulke Greville himself. He put on a mock battle with Edward de Vere, 1572, an entertainment for Queen Elizabeth. There were lots of fireworks going on. It got out of hand. 2 or 3 houses burned down, and a couple of people died from that. And Edward de Vere and Queen Elizabeth and Fulke Greville had to pay out £25 in compensation. And that is my brief overview, and I've got lots more to say later on.
So what I know of him is basically we hear about the tennis court thing, and he was a friend of Philip Sidney. I think that's what people tend to know. But you say he was a friend of Oxford too, and it sounds like he was somebody who was so associated with Shakespeare-related people, but somehow never seemed to connect up with the Stratford guy.
I have a story coming up for later where I will pick up on that and take it a lot further. As far as friends with Oxford, I'm not so sure about friends. Certainly they were acquainted, but he was a huge friend of Philip Sidney, that's for sure. So judging by the tennis quarrel description, it sounds like Fulke Greville took Sidney's side more than de Vere's. Mm-hmm. That's my impression anyway.
Anyone else? Tom takes it away.
Yeah, I want to hear some more about that Stratford connection, but I have the feeling that's coming. That's coming.
Coming later. Yeah.
Okay. What are I go next? So, I think the question is, who was Philip Sidney? Probably what most people know him as a true English war hero who gave his life in the Netherlands for Protestantism. And they may know him as an inspiring Elizabethan poet who was a rival to Shakespeare. Certainly, he and Fulke arrived at, Tom's going to correct me, he always does, Shrewsbury School. Is that correct?
Shrewsbury.
Yeah. Okay. On the same day. They became fast friends, for sure. They apparently sat side by side on a bench, were inseparable, and wrote poetry on the same topic. So yes, very close friends indeed. But perhaps there's another version of Philip Sidney. Okay. Perhaps he was the quarrelsome nephew of the most powerful man in England. That would be Uncle Lester. No, not Uncle Fester from the Addams Family, but Uncle Lester, as in Robert Dudley. Uh-huh. He was also the son-in-law of the government's chief spy master. That would be Francis Walsingham. He was also the favorite student of the government's chief spin master. That would be Mr. Cecil Baron Burleigh. He spent time in Cecil House, not as a ward of the Queen, but he was sent there to learn. Cecil wrote a letter to his father saying that he favored Sidney over all others, but he didn't want to make it show lest the wrong impression be drawn. He might have been a know-it-all mediocre poet with a very loud and prolific cheering section, made up of friends and family of great talent, who were all either related to Uncle Lester by blood or is in his employ, including his sister Mary, Fulke, the poet Edward Dyer, the poet Edmund Spenser, and even Dr. Thomas Muffet, who is probably the source for the Miss Muffet story. All of them possibly created his reputation by substantially editing his work and publishing it after his death, which is true. There was nothing published during his lifetime. He may have been a yappy, kind of ineffectual wannabe statesman who happened, because of his own foolishness, to take a Spanish bullet because he chose to remove his armor got the bullet in his thigh, and died 26 days later from gangrene at very fortuitous political timing for the crown. Yet he received a hero's funeral and a parade and has a cult figure literary reputation. Why and what's the truth? I'm going to be talking later about two movies which I think are really on point for Sir Philip.
Phoebe.
OMG, so excited. Wow, I can't wait to hear Tom and Dorothea talk more. So the person that I chose, I kind of, similar to Dorothea, I feel like maybe has an unfair historical reputation. I chose Gabriel Harvey, who people think of as, even like I saw one of the winning video contest festivals. It's like they just call him pedantic and boring, and everybody talks about what a stuffed shirt this guy is, really uptight. Even people say he's sort of a monster because he gets into this pamphlet war with Robert Greene, and then after Greene is deceased, he's sort of mocking Greene and saying all these nasty things about a recently deceased man, and so that makes him look like a really unclassy kind of character. But I think this story, actually, this is maybe a reverse, where I think it's somebody who was maybe a lot more sympathetic and kind of wronged. And he was sort of a victim and actually kind of a funny guy. So the interpretation that I'm going to give is going to focus on, or the story of his life. He has this long extended pamphlet war, which lasts really for decades, between him and a number of individuals, perhaps. There's Thomas Nash, there's Greene, and then there's other pseudonyms that come out. I'm going to be arguing, or I'm going to be telling the story kind of from Bob Prechter's research, which is going to say that Nash and Greene were both actually pseudonyms for Edward de Vere. You don't have to buy into that if you follow. I think even if you don't want to buy into those angles of other pseudonyms of de Vere, I think you can still get a sense that Harvey is sort of dancing here. He's almost like an improv comic. He's in a sort of impossible situation. So I guess the question that I'll ask for people to consider as we learn more about Gabriel Harvey later is like, what would you do if you were in a long-term, really bitter, nasty feud with an earl? So you're the son of a rope maker, you're close with your brothers, and this earl is basically harassing you in the press, saying all kinds of terrible things about you. Also, I think sponsoring or even participating in putting up plays insulting you. There was a play put on about him called Pedantius that was put up, I think, at Trinity College, and everyone's mocking him, booing him, hissing him. And he actually, as a result of the smear campaign from this play Pedantius, it really hurts his career. He ends up missing a scholarly appointment, which kind of at Cambridge, which kind of hurts him for the rest of his life. So I think Harvey's in a very tough spot, which is that he's feuding with the sock puppets of pseudonyms of this earl who's much more powerful than him. So we're going to see how he kind of rises to that challenge. Yeah.
That's great. It sounds like Phoebe's found an interesting window into academic politics of the 1590s. I would have guessed. So my guy I chose is a gal, Penelope Rich. And ever since I really first heard about her and started reading about her, I found her intriguing because she strikes me as one of the free spirits of the Elizabethan and Jacobean age, a woman who was a true rebel. So she was born Penelope de Vere, sister of Robert de Vere, the Earl of Essex. Yes, that Earl of Essex, Essex Rebellion, Earl of Essex. And in fact, there's a pretty good indication. Historians think she was actually quite actively conspiring with her brother and very much part of the conspiratorial circle of the Essex circle that staged their ill-fated rebellion. But she got off scot-free from that. She seems to have been a bit of a Teflon character in some ways, but she's a fascinating figure. Because with Tom mentioning Fulke Greville and then Dorothea talking about Philip Sidney, it's fascinating how this was such a small world. These people all knew each other. It was like an amazingly small, almost incestuous circle of aristocrats and friends and knights and gentlemen and ladies, and people all knew each other. And Penelope Rich was connected very closely. So, for example, with Philip Sidney, Penelope Rich and Philip Sidney were childhood sweethearts. There's indications that Philip Sidney was infatuated very much as a young man, 21 or so. He met Penelope. She was only 13, 12 or 13. And apparently he became quite infatuated as she blossomed into, by all accounts, an exceptionally beautiful young woman. Fulke Greville, of course, friend of Philip Sidney. Her, as I mentioned, Penelope's brother is the Earl of Essex, a pretty significant figure, and who was one of the closest friends and co-conspirators and hangers-on and buddies of the Earl of Essex, none other than Henry Wriothesley, or Worsley, however that's pronounced, the Earl of Southampton, the very same Southampton to whom Shakespeare dedicates Venus and Adonis, the Rape of Lucrece. Most people think the fair youth of the sonnets. And he's very close to Robert, Earl of Essex, and very close to Robert's sister, Penelope. In fact, the three of them, she is living in her brother's household, apparently, staying there a lot. Henry, Southampton, is also hanging out and has often been linked even romantically or sexually with her brother Robert, and has also been linked with her. So we have a bit of a kind of a bisexual love triangle there, not an incestuous love triangle, but, you know, an interesting connection there. And sure enough, it has been proposed. And this is, I'll wind up my introduction here. Penelope Rich has been proposed by Alexander Waugh and by John Hamill, among Oxfordians, as the Dark Lady of the Sonnets, but not just by them. What's interesting is that actually it was two Stratfordian scholars, two little-known independent Stratfordian scholars, as long as more than 30 years ago, who first suggested that Penelope might be the Dark Lady, which is kind of interesting. So even people who were not Oxfordians have independently come up with the idea that maybe Penelope was the Dark Lady. Now, why would she be the Dark Lady? Well, she has a scandalous reputation. As I said, she's free-spirited, a woman of great sexual agency, passionately committed to living her life as she wanted to, and I'll get into more of that as we have time. But she's my gal. She's my gal, and she's I think the free spirit of the Jacobean Elizabethan age.
I think, Bryan, she's got competition from Anne Vavasor.
Oh, that's another free spirit, I'll tell you.
She has all those characteristics as well.
I could have gone with Anne too, but you know, it's like they're both fascinating people.
And you know what? We're going to do further episodes of these guys to cover all these people.
Absolutely.
And also, one thing that comes out is, strangely, all these people are connected somehow to like people in the Shakespeare's works circle, but none of them seem to have known the Stratford guy. How strange.
About that.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we move on in more depth? Okay. Tom?
Sure, absolutely.
Revel.
Now we get to we're going to interrupt you now, Tom.
We can ask questions and stuff and make connections and stuff. So it's.
I will interrupt myself first by throwing something out to Phoebe. You mentioned the pamphlet wars, and that's something I think that seems strange to us now because pamphlets aren't printed and handed out on the street. But that was the way that people communicated and attacked one another and supported one another, wasn't it, back in the day, by writing pamphlets?
Certainly. I'm actually working on a YouTube video that tells the story of the pamphlet war, where it's actually basically makes it graphically like they're all on Twitter. So it's like they're all kind of tweeting and they all have different accounts. So I think it actually, and the idea of using pseudonyms and stuff. So I think it definitely feels very much like, what Bryan said, like either, kind of intra-fighting in academia or, these literary circles forever and always are petty and nasty and
Just they're like academic English departments.
Yep.
As they say the fights are so bitter because the stakes are so small. But when it comes to authorship, we could say with authorship the stakes are big.
I'm fascinated by the minutiae of it, and I don't know if you will talk about it, Phoebe, in your video. But so there's a bookseller And what does he do? Does he have a stack of pamphlets and people walk by? Do they hang up pamphlets and people say, I like that one and I'll take it? I don't know. Maybe nobody knows that, but those details I find
That's
very
a good basic question, because that ties into this, as we always hear the pamphlet wars and these pamphlets. But
Yeah.
how, I don't know, how did people get them? How were they distributed?
Right.
Yeah. What did they look like? Were they really just like little trifold pamphlets, or were they booklets?
No, I think they were printed. My understanding from a lecture at the Folger is that they were printed on both sides of a single sheet and that they were sold at the booksellers as well. There may be people who know more about it than I do, but that was the impression I had. It's not like there's a newsboy handing them out on the corner,
Right.
but if you go to a bookshop also contained the newest pamphlets, and the price was very low since it was a single sheet. And actually, the fact that any of them survived, considering the flimsiness and the lack of a cover, is pretty remarkable.
Didn't some of them go on for more than just 2 pages, though? I mean, I thought some of them were fairly lengthy.
Front and back, but there may have been like fold it in half, and then you get the 4 sides, right? Depends how you fold the sheet.
Okay.
Interesting.
So, here's my 10 minutes or however long it ends up being, but you will interrupt me and ask questions, I hope. Before actually getting back to Fulke Greville, there's a couple of observations I want to make, and they are, number one, Samuel Schoenbaum, in his book Shakespeare's Lives, says there are enough Shakespeares appearing in old records to keep any drowsy genealogist awake. And they spread into Cambridgeshire, Derbyshire, Leicestershire, and London after the 15th century. So given that William was one of the most common names of the time, one cannot say, with so many Shakespeare families in the country, the only William Shakespeare of the period was from Stratford-on-Avon, just because his name was William Shakespeare or a variation thereon. So they have it from the mouth of one of the most renowned Stratfordians, Samuel Schoenbaum, saying it's entirely likely there's more than one William Shakespeare out there. That's the first point. Second point, in the last newsletter, the evidence from the Osler versus Hemmings court case of 1615 regarding shares in the Globe and Blackfriars theatres, and the details don't really matter here, but what is important is that the evidence says quite clearly that the shareholder, William Shakespeare, was dead in 1615, whereas the man from Stratford died in 1616. Put those two together, and you open the door to the possibility that the shareholder and actor, forget playwright, was not the Stratford man. In other words, there was a shareholder and actor with that name, but not the Stratford man.
Hello.
Okay.
Tom,
But yes,
can I ask a question?
please.
Has it ever been considered by anyone other than me that the person who was using the name William Shakespeare as a writer, because he could not use his own name, also used that name for his business investments in theaters? And when he appeared on a stage, which he was also prohibited from doing because of his position in life, that it was a catch-all for all of his theater-related things that he was not supposed to do, and that after his death, the name is picked up by others who kind of carry the concept along in order to stretch out the usefulness of the name, which had come to be gold.
Come back to me with that after I finish what I'm presenting.
Okay,
here.
let's hear it.
I was just wondering, that's all interesting. Is it an interesting tangent, or is it going to relate to Fulke Greville? Yes.
Right now it's Fulke Greville. So I needed to say those things.
Okay,
and
great.
then get to Fulke Greville.
Okay.
Great.
So,
Take it.
all right. But if the shareholder actor was not from Stratford, why does the first folio prefatory material lead us to think he was? Now, we know it doesn't say Stratford-on-Avon, but we cannot deny that we are led to think it's Stratford-on-Avon. I'm going with that. I think that's a very fair premise. Okay. Now, Jonathan, back to Fulke Greville.
Okay, great.
This is fascinating. He had a personal plea before his death in 1628, which was, quote, desiring to be known to posterity under no other notions than of Shakespeare's and Ben Jonson's master. He wanted to be known as the master of Shakespeare. What does that mean? We really don't know, but we do know that he was a very careful and exacting person. He was not known for hyperbole. Now, we also know, because he said he wanted to be the master of Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, we know that Ben Jonson, of course, played a huge role in the first folio ambiguities that lead to making that connection between the first folio and Stratford-on-Avon. So, here's some conjecture on my part that Fulke Greville and Ben Jonson might have used Fulke Greville's life to create the Stratford narrative, to sow the seeds of a fake connection. Here's why I say that. Let's look at the implications from the first folio prefatory material. That material implies that the author was a man of Stratford and Fulke Greville was the recorder of Stratford from 1606 to 1628. Prefatory material says Sweet Swan of Avon. A biographer says of him that Fulke Greville had a sweet disposition, and we know his crest was a swan, and that he lived in Warwick Castle above the River Avon. From the clothes worn in the Droeshout portrait and the word gentle that's in the prefatory material, we imply the author was a gentleman, and indeed Fulke Greville was. Ben Jonson in the first folio says, advanced and made a constellation there. John Davies of Hereford says of Fulke Greville's poetry, fix him there among the Pleiades, a constellation. A monument without a tomb, and it does say monument, it doesn't say monument. I think we've touched on this before. Monument it can mean monument, most certainly, but it can also mean a body of work. Fulke Greville's huge pillared monument in St. Mary's Church in Warwick is one of the most amazing monuments in England, and radar scans have shown what appear to be three box-like objects inside. But Fulke Greville's body is buried in the family crypt below. So we have a monument, in this case, without a tomb, without meaning outside a tomb. Now, some people use these coincidences to argue that Fulke Greville wrote the works of Shakespeare. I don't believe that for a second. But can a connection be to indicate that Fulke Greville was the master of Shakespeare, meaning the controller of the Stratford narrative? Now, let's try this. The connection is Dorothea's choice, Philip Sidney, and it cannot be emphasized what good friends Fulke Greville and Sidney were. Oh, a whole slew of names here, so I'll do them slowly. So Philip Sidney's nephew, Philip Herbert, marries Edward de Vere's daughter, Susan. Philip Herbert is one of the first folio dedicatees. It's not unreasonable to surmise that Susan inherited or had access to the plays of her father and was the one who arranged for them to get to the publishers of the first folio. That theory has been put forward before, nothing new there. And her husband could share the cost of publication along with his brother William, and we know those were the two dedicatees of the first folio. Now, could Fulke Greville, as an intermediary, become the master of Shakespeare by mastering the route for the publication of the plays? it's reasonable to suppose de Vere had copies of his plays, including the 18 published for the first time in the first folio, in his London house known as King's Place. We talked about that before on an earlier Blue Boar episode. And Fulke Greville bought Edward de Vere's King's Place house in 1609, and therefore possibly gained access to the unpublished plays. Fulke Greville contacts his best friend's nephew, Philip Herbert, one of the dedicatees, Oxford's son-in-law, hoping to get Herbert to finance the first folio publication. He gets Ben Jonson to write much of the dedicatory first folio material in the first folio to point the reader to someone real, albeit with a different name. Why do that? And this is where it goes back to Fulke Greville's life, which I didn't mention before. He, by some measures, saw his life as something of a failure. He was frustrated in his efforts to go and fight on behalf of the country. He was denied certain appointments, and he was an ambitious, very bright man. Could being the master of Shakespeare in some fashion be a recompense for a life illustrious though it was, that we know he looked back on with regret and political disillusionment? Okay, there was a bunch of stuff there. And just to put it in a nutshell, I am fascinated by Fulke Greville saying he wanted to be remembered as the master of Shakespeare and Ben Jonson. So I have put together what I could find to try and make a case for why that would be. And remember, we are led to believe that the author was from Stratford-on-Avon, even though there's evidence that the shareholder died a year before the man from Stratford did. There's a disconnect there that I cannot quite work out. So there we go, guys. Is this just too fantastical? Should I not even?
That's amazing.
What do you think?
I've never heard about that, about him wanting to be the master of Shakespeare. You'd think that would be interesting to Shakespeare scholars. But
where does that come from? I may have missed it, Tom, but where was
I did not say where
he wanted to be the master of Shakespeare?
I will tell you right now.
What was one of Fulke's own letters or something he wrote?
It was from Statesmen and Favourites of England since the Reformation, 1665, by David Lloyd. That's where it comes from. And Fulke Greville died in 1628, so roughly 37 years after his death.
Wow. I mean, you had me going there that maybe he was the author Shakespeare, because it sounds like there's almost an interesting argument. And I'd heard that a few people had suggested, I've heard over the years, that there is an authorship theory, or that a few people have pursued that or suggested the idea that, like a lot of these other kind of minor dark horse candidates like Sackville or Rutland and Darby and others,
Right.
Yeah. Well, again, it just strikes me that somebody saying he wants to be the master of Shakespeare, and traditional Shakespeare scholars have no curiosity about that at all. And he's applied to all these people associated with the first folio, but nobody seems interested in it.
They're not only not curious about it, they're terrified of it. They're absolutely terrified of it.
Tom, when I heard you said that, I came up with a different meaning for master, which is I thought of a schoolmaster. That what Fulke is saying, I am the teacher of Ben Jonson and Shakespeare. In other words, they owe their art to my teaching. So that's kind of the way I took it. That was my first reaction. And then you went on in a different path. Also, Elizabeth Trentham lived until early 1613, even though she sold the house to Fulke in 1609. I doubt she would have turned loose of those manuscripts to him, or that she just left them behind. I doubt she would do that.
I see it as him clearing out the house. In other words, he's selling it. He has the right, to clear out the
Yeah,
house.
I think those are personality. It's personality. It doesn't transfer with the real estate.
But it could have been there could have been plays stuck in some dusty old cubby hole in the mansion somewhere.
Yeah, all of them stuck in between the books in the library. But I think it's fascinating. And I mean, I can definitely see from what you said, a pathway where he becomes almost the manager, the publicist,
Yes.
of the works of Shakespeare and the works of Ben Jonson, that he uses his connections, and I don't want to say middleman because I think that is minimizing his ability, but publicist, facilitator, maybe of those two folios, because Jonson's came first, these huge books, and then the Shakespeare canon comes later. So I am absolutely mesmerized by what you're saying, but I can see some different ways to fit those facts together.
Yeah,
well, I agree. It's very much conjectural. I think I should point out now I've taken quite a bit of time. I want you guys to jump in at this particular point, but at some point I do want to tell you how Fulke Greville died. It's such a sad story. So before we finish, I'd love to jump back with that. But now it's your turn, guys.
Well,
Thanks, Tom.
Here's something, it'll tie it into Dorothea next with Philip Sidney. A note here from Julie saying there's so much more Fulkes in every group. It's like he's connected to everybody associated with the Shakespeare works. He is the editor of Sidney's work. She says, so there's a tie to the editing of First Folio, possibly. So it's like all these people are connected. It's Dorothea, Philip Sidney.
Okay, so I told you I was going to try to condense Philip Sidney into two current films. So how many of you have seen Wag the Dog? 1997 film. Barry Levinson was the director. It was a political comedy. Robert De Niro plays a kind of White House spin doctor, and Dustin Hoffman plays a Hollywood director. Does this ring a bell with anyone? Anyway, let's just say, take those two characters and substitute Burleigh and Walsingham. It's a perfect fit. Anyway, they get together to fabricate a distraction because they have a political problem of monumental size, which is the off-screen president of the United States has been caught dallying with a Girl Scout, and it's right before the election. So what they do is to create a war that doesn't exist in Albania. So you might substitute problem of sex scandal with President of the United States with wanting to cut the head off of an anointed queen who happens to be Catholic and very popular. So equate those two in your mind. A war in Albania, a war in the Netherlands, and then they finally find out what they need to do to get the rally around the flag nationalism going for Protestant England, rah, 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 is to create a war hero. So the war hero in Wag the Dog is a guy named Old Shoe, whom they find along the way. They have some adventures with him. Anyway, what they create from Old Shoe, who never was a war hero, he just becomes this symbol, is this faux grassroots demonstration of patriotism and solidarity, like the hero's welcome for Philip Sidney's body, which came back from the Netherlands and sat rotting for 15 weeks in state while they were hoping for a guilty verdict for Mary Queen of Scots that was pretty much locked up, and then getting Elizabeth to sign the warrant, which took a long time. I will go through the chronology really quickly because I don't want to slow down too much, but here we go. Burleigh wanted Mary Queen of Scots dead since 1571. In early August 1586, the Babington plot was underway and Walsingham was chasing it down, and Burleigh was preparing the evidence throughout August and September. In September 12th, Burleigh gets his instructions from the Queen to go ahead and proceed with the trial, but do not enlarge Mary's crime, she says, and I want no sharp speeches. Well, that goes by the wayside. September 22nd, Philip Sidney is in the Low Country with Uncle Lester, where he has been fighting the Spanish with a little action. And in a foolhardy gesture, he throws off his thigh armor and goes into battle, wounded in the thigh, of course, and gets gangrene. And it takes 26 days for him to die. So they all knew Philip was going to die. They ship poor Frances Walsingham over there. She has the widow's moment by the side of her husband. Are we building the tension? Are we building the pathos? October 14, Mary's trial begins. It's really clear Philip's going to die at this point. He has a apocryphal or real moment where he hands his water to another soldier who is wounded and says, "Thy need is greater than mine." Philip expires on the 17th of October. There is a marker where he was wounded. There is a house where he died marked with a plaque. They bring him home across that narrow channel. The pinnacle he comes in is draped in black sails, black halyards, black tackle, black cloth across his escutcheons, which are on the outside of the pinnacle. He had been knighted 3 years before, not for his own glory, not for his own valor, but because they needed to substitute him for the Duke of Casimir, whom Oxford ran into in France. You might remember that. It's a sidelight for a garter ceremony. And you can't have someone stand in who's not already a knight. So they knighted Philip. Anyway, his body hangs out in the Holy Trinity Minoris Church until October 25th. Mary gets the death sentence. Everyone waits because the queen is tearing her hair out and her heart out about what to do about signing her cousin's death warrant. As you know, Burleigh is pushing. She's resisting. Finally, on the 1st of February in 1587, the queen signs it and pretends she never delivered it. Burleigh and Walsingham grab it, seal it, and rush it off to Fotheringhay. February 8th, Mary Queen of Scots is executed. 3 whacks of the axe to cut her head off. And now they can execute their plan. And so to control the political fallout of that, they wag the puppy. February 11th, Philip's casket is finally borne into a huge parade through the streets to a general mourning. He is buried in Old St. Paul's as a hero. It's the same storyline as in Wag the Dog. Okay. Movie number 2, considerably more fun. Monty Python did a wonderful set of humorous sketches on good Sir Philip Sidney. You can find them on the internet. If you substitute the word poetry for the word pornography in these sketches, they come wittingly close to the truth with a twist of the knife. And here we go. It opens with a Tudor jobs agency where a clerk behind the counter informs a customer that Shakespeare started off here as a temp and that the bottom fell out of the English job market in 1604, which of course is the same year in which the 17th Earl of Oxford ceased to exist. Anyway, the next scene, pornographic bookshop. Again, substitute poetry bookshop. Modern day superintendent of the Vice Squad bursts into the shop dressed in Tudor costume from Antwerp and is repeatedly addressed as Good Sir Philip Sidney, which becomes this trope throughout these sketches. He is very annoyed and he says, "I'm warning you, I'm not Sir Philip Bleeding Sidney." Later, a young woman named Frances is love-struck when her father, Master Walsingham, brands this superintendent as Good Sir Philip Sidney, and the superintendent begins to like the identity. By the third scene, Elizabethan pornography smugglers, the superintendent has accepted that he is Sir Philip Sidney. And when a breathless messenger announces that the Spanish have landed on the coast of the Netherlands, he rides off alone. He announces that despite warnings of the risk, he will go and get the Spanish. He demands that 3 Spanish sailors hand over their smuggled literature. They refuse. He swashes, he buckles, he is victorious. He returns from London. He gets a big parade. He is covered in glory. He returns home. His wife, Frances, is reading blatantly pornographic material. She is embarrassed and she convinces him it is Shakespeare's newest work. Despite being superintendent of the Vice Squad, good Sir Philip Sidney does not recognize what he is hearing. Again, substitute poetry for pornography. Present-day London police burst in, nab the couple. She says, "Oh, the glorious name of Sidney is besmirched." And the camera cuts to a placard on a modern sidewalk outside of a theater, advertising a play by Shakespeare. It is, of course, the same pornography that Francis was reading to good Sir Philip Sidney, who was clueless. Okay, so did John Cleese and the Monty Python Motley Crew get it right? The adjective good is inexorably and somewhat irritatingly attached to his name. He has a touchy temper and he's quick to take offense. His mock reluctance to accept the identity he obviously wants, his goody two-shoes, holier than thou attitude about pornography / poetry, his dim-wittedness in not recognizing it when it's under his nose, his brushes with Shakespeare, his foolish risk-taking for military glory, and the convenient aggrandizement for political reasons by those in power of his ineffectual military accomplishment with a blowout heroes parade in London. And of course, this is all mock satire on his name. So I hope that as we continue, I can give you points, quotes from his work that will illustrate why Monty Python's satire on him is actually, in my opinion, right through the point.
Do you like Philip Sidney, Dorothea?
Do I like him? You know, I tried really hard. Actually, I mean, that's true. I'm being honest. One of the reasons I chose him is because I didn't like him. And I kept thinking, maybe if I really, really dig into him, and trust me, I really dug. I mean, I spent hours preparing for this. I don't like him any better.
Well,
I really think he had a really good connection through Uncle Lester. I think that everybody who wrote about him was indebted to Uncle Lester. And I think that Walsingham and Burleigh desperately needed something to distract from having killed Mary, Queen of Scots. And he was that convenient. I think he was always kind of the puppy. You know, we can talk about the story, 3 insults to Oxford on that tennis court. And, you know, and Philip leaves in a huff, and the Queen and challenges Oxford to a duel. The Queen shuts it down. He later wrote a letter to the Queen giving his reasons why she should not marry the French Duke, Alençon. He was, by the way, in front of the French on that tennis court. Mm-hmm. And he sends her this shepherdess gown made out of wool, to basically saying she should be more humble. What do you suppose she did? She banished him from court. I mean, on the puppy is not just Oxford's temper. I mean, I tried to like him, Tom. I really did. And then when I compared how much his work was rewritten by his sister, I went, I think that's the talent, is the sister, not Philip.
A lot of people think that. And aside from the whole tennis court duel, he has this whole defense of poetry where he has a very different vision of poetry from Shakespeare, who, of course, we think is Oxford. So his rivalry with Oxford does seem like he's a sort of mediocre, pedantic poet who's has a different vision of the poet that most of us are talking about these days.
So just to make it really like condense on that point, so Philip could not abide a play that did not take place completely minute by minute in a chronology. So jumping days or weeks or months, he couldn't deal with it. He couldn't deal with a play that had different scenes on the same stage. So for example, the fact that you might have a ship that was sinking on the stage, and the next minute you're in a battle on the ground, and the next minute you're in a lady's chamber on the same stage, impossible. As we know, Shakespeare had a lot of fun with that in a lot of plays, not only satirizing him, but also, I mean, Henry V, where going on and on and on about explaining how we're jumping, all of that is in reaction to Philip's, when I say his holier than thou attitude about poetry.
So he
That's
was kind of a nemesis of Oxford. I'd like to hear more what Phoebe has to say about Gabriel Harvey, because my sense is Gabriel Harvey was also a nemesis of Oxford over a number of years.
Let me jump in and say,
Yeah.
probably going to have to go a little bit over this week.
Oh, that's fine.
10, 15 minutes, if you're all okay with that, just because theoretically we have 10 minutes left to get through Gabriel Harvey.
Let's go.
So take it away.
Goodness.
Phoebe. What do you
All
have
right,
to
am I on? All right, well,
Hi.
Dorothea and Tom, just fabulous presentation, so interesting. Okay, I'm going to be talking about Gabriel Harvey, his relationship with Edward de Vere, and his pamphlet war against Robert Greene and Thomas Nash, who I'm going to argue, or just we can keep in your head, think of them as two other pseudonyms of Edward de Vere. So this is like 20 years of literary beef all in one little club sandwich kind of thing. So as with all great literary feuds, the protagonists start off on friendly terms. So Gabriel Harvey is a student who's received some patronage from de Vere throughout his scholarly career. However, in 1577, de Vere hires John Lilly over Gabriel Harvey to be de Vere's personal secretary. This leaves Harvey financially in the lurch. So Harvey's kind of stung. He remains cordial with de Vere, but then he makes this famous speech in front of Queen Elizabeth in 1578, and it kind of makes a slight jab at de Vere. It's praising him, but it's in Latin, so people have kind of translated it. He's using his bloodless pen, his petty pen. So he's basically saying de Vere's a little bit, should be picking up a sword sometime instead of a pen. So fast forward a year, and then Harvey is writing a letter to his friend Edmund Spenser, the famous author of The Fairy Queen, and he's complaining to Spenser that there have been parodies around town of the speech that he made, talking about Edward de Vere, and that Harvey, is being mocked at the playhouses. And Harvey doesn't say in this letter to Edmund Spenser who is mocking him, but we can speculate based on his next move. So in 1580, Harvey publishes a poem called Speculum Tuscanismi, which is mocking de Vere for adopting Italianate mannerisms and for being generally, again, bookish and effeminate, kind of an ongoing theme. So a quote from this is, "Vanity above all, villainy next to her, no man but minion, stout, lout, plain, swain, no words but valorous, no works but womanish only." So Harvey publishes this poem about de Vere alongside a personal letter or a personal correspondence with Edmund Spenser. So it's almost like, it's kind of like a Mean Girls move where, it's like, me and this famous person that you think is your friend, we've actually been talking about you behind your back. So he publishes this letter from Edmund Spenser, who de Vere really admires, and it's kind of a flex on Harvey's part. And so in it, basically, Edmund Spenser's also kind of talking about de Vere behind his back. And so this is sort of humiliating to de Vere, seeing that Harvey and Spenser are talking about him behind his back. Harvey pretends, I don't know how this got published. Gosh, it wasn't me. I got hacked. But de Vere is not convinced by this ploy. And de Vere retaliates at this point by, I don't think he wrote this play, but he's kind of produces this play, Pedantius, at Trinity College, mocking Harvey. Thomas Nash will later report the whole university hissed him and the theater made jests of him, bear baiting him with whole bundles of ballads. And this public shaming of Harvey then costs him a prestigious position at Cambridge, delivering a blow to his career prospects from which he will never recover. So maybe de Vere feels a little bit guilty about this job opportunity being lost. So he later offers qualified praise of Harvey under the pseudonym Thomas Nash. Thomas Nash, aka de Vere, publishes a list where he's kind of passing judgment on a number of writers of the day. And he credits Harvey as carrying on in the tradition of Homer, kind of like a tip of the hat to Harvey. Harvey, however, does not accept this little peace offering. He is not ready to make nice, because months later, an anonymous address penned by Harvey and his brother Richard, Gabriel and Richard Harvey, they mock de Vere for having the presumption to pass judgment on other writers. A quote is, "That one Thomas Nash taketh upon himself to judge his betters at his pleasure." And additionally, they pointedly reference de Vere's practice of using anonymous sock puppets to publish his writing, saying, "This Thomas Nash, who I never heard of before, or any such famous obscure man, or any other piperly make play or make bait, showeth himself none." So they're kind of poking at him, like implying, who is this Thomas Nash guy. So this is maybe making de Vere a little nervous that he's getting called on his game. So then Gabriel's brother, Richard Harvey, then publishes another pamphlet insulting de Vere, calling him a liar and a lewd customer. So things are heating up. Richard Harvey had recently embarrassed himself with the publication of a woefully incorrect list of astrological predictions. And de Vere mocks the brother, Richard Harvey, with a satirical pamphlet featuring ludicrous astrological predictions of his own called signed by Adam Foulweather, student of astronomy, emphasizing ass. And so then de Vere publishes another parody by Simon Smelnave called Fearful and Lamentable Effects of Two Dangerous Comets. So at this point, de Vere is using multiple pseudonyms, making fun of multiple Harvey brothers. So now we're in the 1590s. Harvey and de Vere are both in bad shape. De Vere is now broke. He's selling off his estates. Harvey's also not doing well in his career thanks to de Vere sabotaging it. So they're both kind of ready to keep fighting, and now it's going to escalate. So in the summer of 1592, de Vere publishes A Quip for an Upstart Courtier under the pseudonym Robert Greene. And so he's responding to insults that have been levied by the Harveys against de Vere's other pseudonym, Thomas Nash. So basically they're insulting Thomas Nash, but the retort comes back under the name Greene. So Greene actually broadens the scope of his pamphlet war because now they're bringing in Harvey's father. And so he has a scene in this pamphlet, Quip for an Upstart Courtier, where de Vere has Mr. Harvey come out insulting his sons, calling them the limb of the devil, a vainglorious ass, and a fool. And Gabriel Harvey, you can understand, is insulted by this. Now it's like you're dragging his dad into it, and so he gets really upset and he responds, lo, a wild head full of mad brain and 1,000 crotchets, a scholar, a discourser, a courtier, a ruffian, a gamester, a lover, a soldier, a traveler, a merchant, a broker, an artificer, a botcher, a pettifogger, a player, a hustler, a cheater, a beggar, an omnigatherum, a gay nothing, a storehouse of bowed and baggage stuff, unworthy answering or reading, a trivial author for knaves and fools, an image of idleness, an epitome of fantasticality, a mirror of vanity. So then in this same pamphlet, Gabriel then basically threatens to sue de Vere or, the pseudonyms that have been attacking him for libel, which is basically saying, I'm going to have a lawsuit and you're going to get in trouble for writing under these pseudonyms. And this is, it's over. So, he's basically threatening to sue him. So de Vere now has been threatened with a lawsuit and with the exposure of a pseudonym. So what does he do? He does something he thinks is very clever. He decides he's going to kill off Robert Greene, which he does in literary fashion in a series of these 3 long pamphlets, which are all supposedly published on Robert Greene's deathbed, but they're all very funny and they're these kind of burlesque. So the first pamphlets show Greene somberly reflecting on the sins of his life. The first is Greene's growth's worth of wit, bought with 1,000,000 of repentance. The second is the repentance of Robert Greene. And the third is Greene's vision, written at the instant of his death. So the kind of premise and the conceit is that he's like dying instantly, but in slow motion, and is like writing out these long, lengthy woe is me pamphlets, which is kind of absurd. And so de Vere is very pleased with this cheeky maneuver of killing off Greene, and he brags about it as Nash, saying, by the means of Greene's death, thou art deprived of the remedy in law, which thou intended to have against him for insulting thy father. Oops. What action will it bear? Nihilo pro nihilo, none in law. So de Vere is gloating as Thomas Nash about how clever he was to kill off Greene so that you can't sue Greene. And then de Vere, in the same pamphlet as Nash, threatens to put on a play in which he's going to hire Will Kemp, the famous clown, to act as Harvey's father. So he's saying, what it will do upon the stage, I cannot tell, but a clownish action that it will bear. For what can be made of thy father more than a clown? Will Kemp, I mistrust it will fall to thy lot for merriment one of these days. So here, Harvey's dealing with a lot of crap. You have this wealthy, powerful Earl who's insulting your dad. I think at this point, either the father, one of the brothers has died. He's going way below the belt here, and he's killing off people so you can't sue him. So what does he do? So this is kind of how Harvey replies, and he kind of does like sort of an improv. You're supposed to say yes and so he publishes a response pamphlet, which he eulogizes the death of Robert Greene. So he's like, okay, yeah, you're right. Robert Greene is dead. And then he's basically mocking Robert Greene as he would insult de Vere. So he says, oh yeah, poor Robert Greene, may he rest in peace. Yeah, he was so poor and he was always cheating on his wife and he was a social pariah. And, so he writes a letter to his friend claiming to have witnessed Greene's tragic deathbed scene, where he's saying that Greene died of a surfeit of pickled herring, which is kind of a colloquial phase of the time, similar to saying, oh, Robert Greene died of too much bologna. And then he says, truly, I have been ashamed to hear of some of the reports of his most woeful and rascal estate, how the wretched fellow, or shall I say the prince of beggars, pleaded for some few shillings and was attended by lice and would pitifully beg a penny pot of wine, and he could not get any of his old acquaintance to comfort him or visit him in his extremity. Who in London hath not heard of his dissolute and licentious living, his ruffianly hair, unseemly apparel, and more unseemly company, his impious profaning of sacred texts, his continual shifting of lodgings, his beggarly departing in every hostess's debt, his pawning of his sword, cloak, and whatnot when money came short, his impudent pamphleting and desperate libeling when other stratagems failed, his keeping of Cutting Ball's sister, a sorry ragged queen of whom he had a bastard son in Fortunatus Green, and his forsaking of his own wife, too honest for such a husband. So he's digging in at all these kind of flaws and things that De Vere is publicly reputed as kind of his flaws. And so Harvey then claims that Green was buried next to Bedlam Insane Asylum, which is close to where I think Fisher's Folly was, where De Vere lived. And then he's also saying this kind of joke about the bastard son in Fortunatus with the prostitute who's the sister of a notorious cutpurse named Cutting Ball. And then he also claims that Robert Greene's final letter was to his wife asking her to pay his laundry bill. And he also gives him a nickname, Purse Penniless. So basically Harvey is responding, getting a lot of digs in at De Vere, even though supposedly he's writing this eulogy about Robert Greene. And Harvey also attaches 22 sonnets eulogizing Greene's death, including one from his deceased father, John Harvey, welcoming Robert Greene to the afterlife, in which Harvey has his father write, "Come, fellow Greene, come to thy graping grave, bid vanity and foolery farewell. Thou overlong hast played the mad-brained knave, and overloud hast rung the bawdy bell. Vermin to vermin must repair at last. These hungry worms think long for their repast." So Harvey finishes this is his final coup de grace. Like, this is a long thing, 22 poems. He's going for it, really mad at De Vere. And he once again includes a poem that he says is written by Edmund Spenser, De Vere's friend. So it's once again this little Mean Girls maneuver. And maybe this is what gets under De Vere's skin the most, because De Vere scrambles to do damage control. So he asks his friend Thomas Watson to write a eulogy celebrating Robert Greene. But unfortunately, Watson dies days later, leaving Greene unmourned. And so then De Vere has to start writing eulogies for Robert Greene himself, which he does under other sock puppets, such as BR and RB, gentlemen. And then in Greene's News, both from heaven and hell, BR claims to have been visited by Robert Greene's ghost with a plea for revenge. And Robert Greene's ghost says to BR, "I am the spirit of Robert Greene. Reply to their twofold edition of invectives. Awake, secure boy, revenge thy wrongs, remember me." And then there's another eulogy that he writes as Henry Chettle, who talks about how handsome Robert Greene was. I liked when Harvey was insulting the hair, being ruffian-like. And then, yeah, so this goes on and on. And they kind of continue sniping at each other, and they try to make peace, and it doesn't go well. Basically, it keeps going until the Archbishop of Canterbury passes a law, which is, says, you guys can't keep doing this. And so then it stops. But modern scholars basically have totally misinterpreted this entire episode. And so it makes it seem like, wow, what a jerk. Gabriel Harvey was making fun of a dead man. What's wrong with this guy? So this is a quote from, some modern scholars. And I'm taking this kind of a potpourri from Bob Prechter's Oxford's Voices. "The virulence of Harvey fills me with disgust at his attempt to deface the monument of the dead. Harvey sits like a vampire on Greene's grave, sucking blood from his corpse. Greene had been but a short time in his grave when the pen of Gabriel Harvey endeavored to blacken his memory in a work, the fierce malignity of which has thrown an indelible stain upon the character of its author." Yeah, there's also kind of, we can't see it here, but if you look on Wikipedia, the most famous image, and it's like on his Wikipedia page for Robert Greene, is this crazy picture of him sort of looking like he's wearing a banana, but it's supposed to be him in his death shroud, but he's writing away. So I think, that's telling a story like it's all this kind of wacky, misunderstood prank joke war. So yeah. That's a little bit about Gabriel Harvey, who I think was funnier and was more deserving. And I think he was loyal to his family, and he was in a tough spot. What do you do when an earl is mocking you under fake names? You fight.
We've got to move on to. I'm sorry about this, but because that's all.
I'm done.
Whoa, but what it does show is if you put a slight twist on the context of something, you can get a whole different picture of everybody involved. And
I think it's amazing. I mean, it sounds like they didn't need Twitter back then. I mean, we have nothing on that now. Like this was social media and Twitter wars gone wild.
That's what I love about having you here, Phoebe, is you put the modern spin on things. Like when you describe the nobility and seen as the mean girls, you go, okay, I totally get it. Suddenly it's not removed anymore. It's
it's very human.
Girls.
It's
Human.
very relatable.
Human.
And I think for me, honestly, if there's anything I take away from this whole episode, it's like, you just got to take the high road. You just got because it's like both of these men who could have been doing so much else with their time and their energy, but they're not doing well. And so they just fighting to the bitter end. Whereas like, so it's, for me, it's like it's a morality tale as well, which is you just got to let it go.
Bryan, we've got like 10 minutes. We're going 15 minutes over today. Can you fit it into there? Penelope Rich.
Yeah, I can say more. I still. So I do have to ask you, Phoebe. So who do you think was Pierce Penniless? So that was Harvey attacking Nash.
I think that's de Vere saying, "Oh, look at this nobleman who hasn't got a pot to piss in. Look at Mr. Pierce Penniless, Purse Penniless." So it's like it's like a new nickname that he gives him about how he's broke.
And there was did Nash? I read somewhere that there were some of the pamphlets where Nash himself was calling himself Pierce Penniless, and was that maybe Oxford mocking himself?
I think that's him. I'm pretty sure that. Yeah. And then so then there's a bunch. So I think that's Oxford trying to like appropriate what the name that he's being called. And then he's spinning it. So then he basically is like, yeah, that's right. I'm going to go by Pierce Penniless. Like he tries to own it.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think I'm not positive 100%, but I think that he's then owning the nickname that Harvey gives him.
Ralph makes a little point here. I think he says, when you think about it too, all these people were pretty young at the time. So we've got a bunch of young people with a lot of energy. And I mean,
yeah.
Although if Oxford is involved, at this point, he's like 40 winters have besieged his brow, because he's been around the track a few times by the early 1590s. But so anyway, so more about Penelope Rich. I mean, the funny thing about it is I think what Phoebe's describing in this pamphlet wars is the early 1590s. And of course, I think Sir Philip Sidney is already dead by then. He died in 1586, as Dorothea was saying. But I see 1593 as a really crucial year. That's like a real turning point year. It's the year, of course, that the first work is published under the name Shakespeare, Venus and Adonis, dedicated to Henry, the Earl of Southampton. I won't try to pronounce the Risley, Worsley, whatever, but we all know Southampton, the fair youth. He dedicates Venus and Adonis to this person. Now, 1593 is also the year that Oxford's legitimate son and heir, Henry de Vere, the future 18th Earl of Oxford, is born. And so what, brings all these things together? And of course, we have to wonder if the fair youth, if Southampton is the dedicatee of Venus and Adonis, which is all about a beautiful youth being pursued by Venus, if that's the fair youth in the sonnets, and I think a lot of people view there's very close connections between the sonnets and Venus and Adonis, then, who's the dark lady tied up in this? And so the funny thing is that Penelope Rich is right at the center of all this. Whatever the connections were between Southampton and de Vere, we know for a fact that Southampton and Essex were quite close. These guys were hanging out together. They go to Ireland together. In fact, Queen Elizabeth, she got fairly annoyed a few times because Southampton wanted to tag along to Ireland and Essex wanted to make him like second in command or master of the horse or something in Ireland. And Queen Elizabeth forbade this. She didn't want Southampton running off to Ireland. He went along anyway as a personal aide to Essex. So he was, he was infatuated with Essex, or he wanted to go off to war. He was like a fanboy or something like this. There was some kind of close connection between Essex and Southampton. And there are a lot of indications. And John Hamill is a great book. So some of you, if you have a look at the secret Shakespeare sex scandals, gets into a lot of this about Penelope Rich, and you might or might not end up embracing the theory there, but John pursues this notion that Penelope Rich might have been the Dark Lady, which Alexander Waugh presented, about 8 years ago, the vulgar scandal theory of the Dark Lady and of the sonnets. And he points to a lot of references around this time, including in things like Willoughby his Avisa, which is this weird satire published in 1594. And a lot of these references do seem to be commenting on people who look an awful lot like Southampton, Penelope Rich, and Oxford. Now, of course, the references are veiled and they're cryptic in many cases. So they're open to interpretation, they're open to debate. And obviously this whole subject, like who is the Dark Lady, that's really deep. And there are a number of candidates for the Dark Lady. But Penelope Rich is an intriguing candidate. She was known to dress in black. She loved black. She dressed in black. She was blonde. She had golden hair. And everyone says she was incredibly beautiful, but very dark eyes. And she was very free-spirited and flouted conventional morality. She was in love with Philip Sidney. She wanted to marry him. Her father supported her marrying Philip Sidney, but then her father dies, and Philip Sidney's prospects go south. For a while, it looked like Philip, who's the nephew of Leicester, as Dorothea mentioned, was going to inherit some of Leicester's estates. But then Leicester gets remarried and has a male heir himself. And so Philip Sidney's just back to being a poor gentleman, scholar, and poet. And so Penelope's family nixes the idea of her marrying him. She's forced to marry this older, rich guy, Robert Rich, and she's very unhappy with him. And so she's an unhappy wife. She eventually starts an affair with Charles Blount, another aristocrat, and they carry on almost an open affair. And she has a number of children out of wedlock with Charles Blount. And eventually, she ends up divorcing. Robert Rich and Penelope get divorced in 1605, and she marries Charles Blount, who was her longtime lover and the father of all of these illegitimate children she had. She does it in defiance of church law, and she and Blount are both expelled from the court of King James because this is so scandalous, but she doesn't care. This is the guy she's loved and been with all these years. She marries him. He dies a few months later, and then she dies in 1607. I mean, she's an amazing figure. She thumbs her nose at all of this misogyny, this sexism, these double standards of the time. She lives her life the way she wants to. And quite possibly, according to Waugh and Hamill, she may have surrogated an heir for Oxford in 1592, 1593. The theory is that she and Southampton basically produce an heir for Oxford and his second wife, Elizabeth Trentham. Anyway, so I can't get into more details than that. It's too complicated, but it's a fascinating story. And she has emerged as a very interesting candidate to be the Dark Lady. And she's connected with Essex, the Essex Rebellion. That's her brother. She's connected to Philip Sidney, her true love at a very young age. She's connected to Southampton. Even if she didn't father a child, even if she wasn't the mother of Southampton's child, they're very close. The sister and brother, Penelope and Essex, they're both very close to Southampton. And there are all these indications that they're somehow mixed up with Oxford, this older player poet who's been around the track a while and who's desperate to obtain an heir by this point in the 1590s.
So, and I think we need to wrap up fairly quickly, but I'm going to throw out at some point. Again, it just sounds to me like all these people are circling around the world of Shakespeare, and yet none of them seem to know him, if you go by the traditional story. And another thing that strikes me in all this is Stratfordians seem to want to take this whole period as straightforward. Like, when you go, it's really all these weird word games and mysteries and cryptic things going on, but they want it all to be right on the surface. I want to end here with.
So do we have time to hear how Fulke Greville died?
Oh, sorry. Yes, yeah, I did. I know
what happened to Fulke?
Sorry about that. Don't leave it as a. Okay, then I'll wrap it up. How did he die?
20 seconds. It's a really sad story. He had a servant by the name of Ralph Haywood who found out that he wasn't left very much money in Fulke Greville's will, and so he stabbed him. And then this servant went into the next room and killed himself. But Fulke Greville was still alive in agony, as you can imagine. And the physicians at the time took a look at the stab wounds and filled them with animal fat in order to build up the muscle, if you will. And that turned rancid, and he died basically of sepsis in complete agony. 74 years old. And 74 in those days was pretty old, but tragic way to die.
And he sounds like almost one of the most admirable of all the people we've been talking about, too.
He does, doesn't he? Yes.
I mean, everyone seems to like him.
Yeah.
Since everybody circles around Philip Sidney, I want to go back to a note Patrick sent over quite a while ago. And he said, like him or not, Philip Sidney, on the positive side, he provides incontrovertible evidence that Shakespeare didn't write Henry V. Because if you go by Ramon Jimenez's works on this, Shakespeare was mocking. First of all, he couldn't mock a great statesman like Philip Sidney supposedly was, but just the timing doesn't work out. So, and also I was thinking too, he's provides some good parallels with Oxford, like he didn't publish any of his works. Stigma of print, why didn't, that ties into support for Oxford. And also I've heard it read, his sonnets, Astrophil and Stella. Stella was Penelope Rich. And everyone thinks there was a big conspiracy theory. But as somebody's pointed out, in all a lot of letters at the time, people knew that. They just didn't say it out loud. They knew who Stella was. But so is it a conspiracy if you just know not to talk about certain things?
And it's autobiographical too. The Orthodox scholars say, Elizabethans didn't write autobiographical stuff. Well, Philip Sidney's sonnet sequence is all about his love for Stella, Penelope Rich. It's totally autobiographical.
And people knew it.
So
but they just wouldn't talk about it.
And the strangest thing about that book, it's dedicated to his wife, Frances.
All these poems are for Frances. Yes, they are.
They're all dedicated to Frances.
She might have said, well, thanks a lot.
Actually, one quick word on Philip Sidney. One thing he did do really quickly, Oxford actually got the naval appointment to be master of the horse for the war in the Netherlands. He got his ship over there. He got his men over there. He spent a lot of money. He got himself over there. He got to Flushing. He went north 4 days at The Hague, and he stood and he waited with the other commanders for instructions because he had a letter from Burleigh saying he had that commission. But Leicester went over Burleigh's head to the Queen. Leicester got himself appointed in Oxford's spot. He brought Sidney with him. Oxford had to go back because he got recalled by Elizabeth, and Sidney died in that war. It could have been Oxford. So we might have to thank Philip Sidney for taking the bullet that could have killed Shakespeare.
Fascinating. I never understood that episode. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So in a way, let's sort of give Philip Sidney his due in an indirect way towards Shakespeare, I guess. And, okay, thanks everyone. We went over. People I hear from around the room were saying, thank you, nice discussion. Thank you, everyone. And
fascinating stuff, yeah.
Such great presentations, guys. I learned so much.
Really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Learned a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Bye, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks for being with us. Bye-bye.